You need friends to survive. Akbar and Mukhtar are best friends. Akbar is 20 years old and Mukhtar 16. They both fled as refugees from South Sudan in the Darfur area, through the desert and into Libya, where they met in slave-like conditions. And it was in these conditions they quickly found out they had to help each other to survive. They needed to become friends. They both managed to get on a boat sailing towards Italy. The boat was too small for the 300 people in it, and too old to actually make it all the way. And on the waters, the waves got bigger and bigger, and more water came into the boat. And at some point, people started to panic. And as they panicked, they get scared. They were afraid of dying on a sinking ship. So one by one, they started to throw each other off into the water. But you don't fight somebody who has the friends to protect them. And Akbar and Mukhtar protected each other. They survived the journey. They reached the shores of Italy. And through Italy, they traveled by foot up all the way into the Calais camp in northern France. Still best friends, still trying to survive, because they had something bigger than themselves. They had to survive for each other and for the community. Arriving to the Calais camp, you have to go under a bridge, and through that bridge, a view of tents would hit you. People walk by you, some without jackets, some without proper shoes. You could walk freely into the camp because there was no fences blocking the way. This was an unofficial refugee camp. As you walked into the camp, you would walk on narrow roads. And these roads were more mud than actually roads. And when it had been raining, the sand ground would be filled with water. And giant water pools would be everywhere. And the tents where people were living would be flooded. There was actually so much water, but no clean water. Neither no toilets. So people had to shit in these fields, and the shit would just come closer and closer and closer to where people were living. And the rats this big would sometimes wake you up at night, sitting next to you. This is the jungle. Necessities like food and new clothes were mainly provided by aid workers and volunteers. And it was in these conditions that small communities sprung up. In the camp, there were 22 different nationalities, springing from the Middle East to Africa and even the Balkan countries. The main nationalities were Eritrean, Sudanese, Afghan, Kurdish, and Syrian refugees. And all these different nationalities lived in their own small communities. And it was in this place, in Calais, they built their own mini-city. They even had shops. And when I say shops, I mean 4 poles of wood with some plastic wrapped around it. Inside a gas stove where they can cook, outside a diesel generator pumping. And inside again, you would hear some music from the TV playing Bollywood movies or even Titanic. And it was in these shops, these bars and these cafes that boys like Akbar and Mukhtar would sit most nights, drinking their coffee or tea. And they were cold, they were hungry, but they had one thing. They had the hope for a better future, something I didn't find in the Calais city itself. Here I found some of the biggest cases of hopelessness I've ever seen. Before, Calais was a city that held communist beliefs. It had a large industry and people worked on the factories. Now most of the factories are left to the east, as in most countries in Europe. The largest party is Front National. And the city has become one of the poorest ones in France. And people are stuck with no sense of a better future. unlike the people in the jungle, who all knew they were not staying. In their mind, this was only temporary, because they had hope for something else. And that hope brought them exceptionally all together to demonstrate for better conditions, for a better future, in what was, at this time, one of the worst refugee camps in Europe. Half of the camp marched together, and the next day, there was no news in the media about it. And nothing happened later on. And for some people, the hope they had turned into despair. And that is one of the worst things that can happen to you. Because when you lose hope, you start slowly to die inside. You start not taking care of yourself, and therefore become a danger to yourself and everyone around you. When society loses hope, the law of the jungle rules. And it was in this jungle I met Akbar and Mukhtar and thousands of other refugees in the tough conditions, in the mud, in the shit, as I decided to spend 1 year living and working in the Calais Jungle. So, what the fuck am I doing in one of the worst refugee camps in Europe? In 2015, I was depressed. I needed a purpose in my life. So I decided to give all my stuff away, leave my 2 jobs, quit my education, say goodbye to the girl I dated at that time, pack a backpack, and then travel by foot through Europe. And the goal was to have no goals. However, I wanted to see one thing. I wanted to see this refugee camp I've heard about in Calais, because in my mind it was so abstract that there could be such a large refugee camp in Northern Europe. So when I arrived there, it didn't take me long to realize I needed to be there. And I slept in the jungle alongside the refugees. And that gave me and some of the other volunteers the opportunity to find out how many women were in the camp, how many children, and what was the actual needs of these people. And we quickly found out that the women had no real safe space. They needed a place to feel comfortable and secure. They needed clothes that actually fit them and sanitation. So we built a shelter for the women and children. And the women would take their children with them, and more children would come. And at some point, it more and more turned into a kindergarten. And we would play with these kids, and we would paint, and we even had a cinema. But these things began to attract teenage boys. And if in the camp, more and more unaccompanied teenage boys were living by themselves. And if there's something that's not a good idea, it's to have women who need a little break from men and small children together with hormone-driven teenage boys. So we built a shelter for the teenage boys. And at the beginning, I sat in this shelter by myself. But eventually, more and more boys would come, and more volunteers as well. And that meant that we could actually start working with the boys. And we did 2 things. We did activities and a tracking system. And we began to find more boys in the camp. But the boys were quite hesitant to come with you when you mentioned the shelter. And that was actually a quite good thing, because these boys needed to be in survival mode and not go away with strangers. Some of these boys even had knives up their sleeves, so they were always on guard. The biggest breakthrough in contacting these boys was when we started a 3 times a week football training at a proper football field, and hundreds of boys began to come to the shelter. Until one day, when we heard the sound of and smoke surrounded us. It was the French riot police shooting tear gas canisters into the football field where we were playing. And as they were shooting, they shouted, Calais Jungle, go monkey, go monkey. And I tried to talk to some of these French policemen, and eventually one of them cracked down. And he said he didn't really want to be there, but he had 4 children he needed to provide for. And him and his family also needed to survive. This was, of course, a big letdown for the boys. And they had to go back to the muddy tents, the shit, the rats, nights spent on jumping on lorries going to Britain, and fire starting more frequently in the camp itself. These boys were not just trying to survive, they were in survival mode. And it was very important you didn't take that away from them, because otherwise they could break. And there was no room for weakness in this situation. However, life went on in the jungle. New things arrived, toilets, pretty nice, clean water stations, and things began to get better. And then they announced the demolition of the camp itself. And the boys reacted in quite different ways. Some got quiet, some got aggressive. However, we never tried to break them down. We never tried to take the survival mode away from them and go into the traumas. However, we always tried to be there for them. They could act like lunatics one day, and the next day they'll be met with a hug. And this was unconditional love, a stability we could provide in an otherwise chaotic place. There were so many threats in this environment. The threat of getting raped, the risk of getting involved with smugglers. Smugglers would force small children to do errands for them. So these boys always had their defenses up because of the environment they were in. Environment-determined survival. If you guys grew up in a shitty place where dangers is all around you, you survive in a quite different way than if, for say, you grew up in a city like this one, here in Denmark. But there's never only pure survival. In the camp, I would see refugees saving their dignity by maintaining their appearance or by action. And one day, I had a woman coming up to me, and she was from Afghanistan, and she was a former university professor. And she lived with her 4 children alone in the camp. And as we talked, she cried. Not because of the poor condition her children were living in, but because, as she said, Aske, it's so hard always to ask for help. It's so hard to have nothing to do. So we helped her setting up a little school where she could teach. But this was such a clever woman, because by asking for a purpose, she saved her dignity and she saved her own self-worth. And in the camp, I would see people sitting in their tents, embraced by hopelessness and despair, doing nothing. I saw people frozen by fear, unable to take that leap when their life was on the line. When you cannot take action, you cannot survive. And what drives that action is hope. Hope for a better future. A hope so strong, a dream so strong that you cannot take it away from you. In the camp, it was nearly impossible to persuade the refugees to go another way, because this dream had taken them so far through so many dangers. And the hope had different variation, but it always came down to one thing: the hope for a better future. In the camp, I'll be waking up by a little kid called Everest, 9 years old. And he waked me up because we had to give out food for the families. Everest spoke 4 languages. And he helped me with many things, for example, translating when we gave out food. Eric's dream was to go to UK, get to a safe place, get an education, and someday maybe become a professor that could provide the world with new ideas and new solutions. We all want a brighter future for ourselves. You, me, everybody here in this room want a brighter future for ourselves. The difference is that we are not entirely sure what that dream is. But the refugees do, because they want what we have. They want a place to live, clean water, peace. They want the opportunity to make something out of themselves, because what they come from is a place without hope. And if there's something I've learned in the jungle, it is that when society loses hope, the law of the jungle rules. You all have to survive. Survival is bigger than yourself. So what is your hope? Thank you.